Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Giobbi. This week we are looking at media addiction. So, last time I ran this class, we read the book Irresistible by Adam Alter. And that book is phenomenal. I mean, there's a TED Talk that I'm going to ask you to watch. Please view that. We're going to and maybe even watch that first to understand the role of our emphasis on looking into dopamine through this text that we're studying. This course, Dopamine Nation, by Anna Lembke, medical doctor. Let's see, to ease into this, to find an entrance way into this. As you'll see in Adam Alter's TED Talk, also the interview that I listed here with Terry Gross, and also there are a few. I have an APA interview with Adam Alter. This is going to be good foundation work for you to understand what Lemke is talking about in her book. And by way of our reading the Gary Wilson book on pornography and the roles of dopamine they're finding here, this should build on our previous section on pornography addiction, sex addiction. I shouldn't say traditionally, but for the past decade, we've had a real predominance when talking about any kind of addiction of the medical model. And the medical model, of course, is the model taught in medical school. And as you'll see, Anna Lembke is a medical doctor, MD. So she was trained in the medical model tradition, which is the idea that a substance that becomes addictive, such as heroin or alcohol, has some sort of chemical causation that alters things in the brain to create craving. And a distinction had been, over the past decade, there'd been quite a distinction of what you could call like a biologically based addiction, and things that were addictive or non-addictive. So many of the introduction to psychology textbooks, the last time I taught intro was about a long time ago, almost a decade ago, 7-8 years ago. But I remember the textbook that we were using at the time by a prominent cognitive psychologist. You probably used this book. I forget his name off the top of my head. But he discussed about the biological foundations of addiction. So cigarettes were brought up, and the idea that nicotine leaves the body after 48 hours. So any chemical dependency is gone. So any craving that exists beyond that is psychological craving. And in this kind of thinking about addictions, things were described as either being addictive or non-addictive. A popular one that also occurred in the Introduction to Psychology textbooks was the idea that something like cannabis, marijuana, was non-addictive, or that hallucinogens were non-addictive. And based on my own experience, I had trouble with this because I knew that I knew from experience in life. It was just my opinion has ecological validity, lived experience, which is my emphasis in psychology, is lived experience. And through talking with others, showed me that anything could become addictive. It didn't necessarily have to have some kind of chemical imposition. And yes, people become addicted to marijuana. I've often, in my investigations of this, in hallucinogens and shamanic traditions, since this is now a hot topic, I've often mentioned to students in lecture that I have met people in my life who smoke weed to escape, or take mushrooms or sacred mushrooms to escape. And I also have met people who smoke weed to encounter their unconscious, to encounter themselves. And so these are two different intentions. One is to run away from oneself, the other is to encounter. Maybe some people want to take these substances for a party, the others want to take it for contemplation and self-exploration. Same substance, two different intentions. So many of these ideas have been on my mind, that this distinction of what would truly be like a biological addiction versus a psychological addiction were all on my mind. They were on my mind from the beginning of this predominant model that I think comes from psychiatry, enters into the insurance company driven DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and then it makes its way necessarily to psychologists, talk therapists, who are, if they're accepting insurance, are obliged to make these diagnoses and use this DSM system. I understand that we now are in a time where we follow, as psychologists, what's known as the biopsychosocial model, taking into consideration biological considerations, social, psychological considerations, thoughts, emotions, and social implications. And I think this is a great model. I don't really believe that everyone puts the same weight on those three and sees them kind of holistically or monistically, instead seeing them as some kind of competing separate entities, which I have from my philosophical tradition going back to Spinoza and Freud's teachers, Spinoza, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche. I have an understanding of things in a more holistic and monistic way, rather than a dualistic Cartesian way, mind and body. As I had mentioned last time, rather than seeing biological causes of behavior, I like to see a set of glasses that look at things at a magnification that can see a phenomenon on the biological level. I then like to say you can put on a different power glasses and see things at the lived experience level. You can then take off your glasses and see the big picture, the social level. And I think for me, in my experience, this has been a much more useful model to think of things, rather than seeing a cause and effect relationship between biology, cells, and neurochemistry causing behavior. I think it's a correlation, not a causation. This attitude is finally, after many years of this attitude that I've adopted from the traditions that I just mentioned to you, from Baruch Spinoza in the 1600s through Arthur Schopenhauer into Friedrich Nietzsche, up into contemporary Freud, the psychodynamic thinkers, Abraham Maslow, his book, The Psychology of Science, all in the humanist tradition, existential tradition, phenomenological tradition. These all informed what I studied clinically. A great person that I would say his texts are available for you to read and to think about in his interviews was the student of Wilhelm Reich, who is Fritz Perls, the Gestalt therapist. And he had his own troubles, as do most great thinkers, but he emphasized a getting away from the why. He said, why are childish questions, and you want to understand the how, the function, how something is functioning, not why it's happening, but how it's happening. He said that's the useful piece of information. And in this idea, when I encountered Adam Alter's book, Irresistible, which if we had I want to diversify what we're reading, but this book is so good. I encourage you, watch the interview, please, necessarily, and then go out and get the book and read it and soak up what he has to say, because what he's describing, he's a behavioral economist. Behavioral economist is someone who is a psychologist that is kind of like a modern day neuroscientist slash behaviorist slash cognitive psychologist, all kind of together, and looking at with much more subtlety than simple reward and punishment schedules, looking at anticipations of cost-benefit analysis and things of this nature. But it's much more sensitive than the old Jeremy Bentham utilitarianism from centuries past. And it's a nice piece of information. I wouldn't rest my entire way of looking at it on behavioral economics, on life, but I think it's a useful model to think about. And what Alter presents is something that was in spirit with what I experienced and I was drawn to in psychodynamic psychology and existential phenomenological humanistic psychology. Also Buddhist psychology, Eastern philosophy. And that is that we can be addicted to virtually anything. It's not just a chemical dependence, because the chemical or the activity. So I was a smoker when I was young, living in Europe, thought this is what you do when you're an intellectual. You smoke cigarettes. So I was smoking the Gauloises, the French cigarettes. And when I would stop smoking the cigarette, I knew intellectually that after 48 hours, the nicotine was out of the system. There was no more nicotine dependence, cause and effect medical model stuff. But I still had the desire to smoke cigarettes. And what that desire was about was that psycho and social aspect of things. The setting. It was when you're in your 20s, I was hanging out in cafes and bars in Brussels, in Belgium, and in Paris, in France, and something you did was you had a drink and you smoked a cigarette, and the people that the musicians and others, the artists I was hanging with, they smoked cigarettes. So it was part of this this socializing thing that you smoked cigarettes. It's what you did when you were in the group, It's the psychological aspects. It was ritual, the ritual of bringing this object up and lighting it, and at the right time for a pause in the conversation, to even use the cigarette as a prop in the emphasis of the presentation and conversation and whatnot. It was all part of a certain self-view. Interestingly enough, since in this example, one morning I woke up and I had no interest in smoking cigarettes anymore. And I haven't had a cigarette since. I just had no interest in smoking cigarettes. My interest was gone. I never had withdrawal symptoms. I never had any type of desire, nothing, just no interest. And it occurred to me, after meditating on this and thinking about this, what had shifted was my self-view. I no longer viewed myself as a cigarette smoker. It just didn't fit my self-view. And when my opinion of my self-view, when my conscious awareness of myself became one that was not a smoker, but was involved in my self-view changed, and all of a sudden the desire changed. The desire was gone. And this really tuned me into the psychological aspects of addiction. What's going on? Adam Alter writes the book, 2017, writes the book Irresistible, and it's all about the distinction between doing away with this idea of a cause and effect biological addiction to substances and looking at behavioral addictions. Remember, he's a behavioral economist. Behavioral addictions. You can become addicted to anything. A behavior, a substance, it's not just isolated to an addictive chemical. Now, I think that I tend to take, like as I said, the lived experience model. I'm not a neuroscientist. However, I think the neuroscience is interesting and it quite overwhelmingly supports lived experience. And this is the idea that there's some correlate. Heroin, alcohol, other chemical substances, sugar, television shows, the smartphone, social messaging, likes, the thumb likes on the social awareness platforms, social media platforms, all of these things have an underlining third term, something else. And it's coming to reveal itself that that third thing is dopamine, the neurotransmitter dopamine. I'm sure it's much more complicated than just dopamine, but this is the hot thing now. This is what's being investigated. When I was just entering psychology, the big thing was genetics. Everything, the genome mapping was going to be the big deal. Then we got brain mapping, and that was going to be the big deal. Neuroscience, neuroimaging. And little by little, it flares up, it becomes the fad, and then people realize, this isn't the answer to everything. It's not going to be the big Newtonian fantasy that suddenly this concept explains everything. Well, we get these trends. The longer you're in psychology, you'll see these trends. And dopamine is the latest in this with addictions. However, there's something different about this dopamine question. And that is the fact that it's not claiming to explain everything, but it is, there are tangible effects for understanding dopamine and behavioral addictions, or any addiction of any sort. So Adam Alter focuses on screen addiction. This is a really big deal. I know that I have young student on piano, brilliant young student on piano, who is obsessed with the screens. Father's a tech guy, in the technology field, and he feels there's no problem with screens. This is just another thing that we interact with. I see an unhealthful preoccupation with screens, ruminating over screens and games and things of this nature. Now, this is a young 10-year-old who's been unrestricted with screen time, and some people are better at forestalling instantaneous gratification, as we know the Walter Mischel marshmallow study. Some people are naturally just better, or maybe they've learned it. I don't know where it comes from. The why isn't so important. The how is. They are able to forestall instantaneous gratification, to say no. And what Alter's finding is that this underlying dopamine phenomenon in our brains is really what seems to be the underpinning of this thing we call addiction. Think about some of the things that you deal with. If you have a smartphone, where we look at these once every 4 minutes, the statistics tells us. And once every 4 minutes, we check our mobile phone, our smartphone. Did someone text us? What's going on? Fear of missing out. It turns out that, if you recall, there's this idea of the opponent processing theory of color vision. And an opponent processing theory is the idea that if you look at one color long enough, it will actually activate a corresponding opposed color. So that the idea here is that the cones process two colors, and you can exhaust one color, and then once that's exhausted, the other one comes to the forefront. This is my kind of gist. Revisit your introduction to psychology textbook for opponent processing theory and color. Well, the reason I assign Lemke's book is medical doctor who describes the opponent processing theory with dopamine. It turns out that not unlike most neurotransmitters, they have more than one function. So when we talk about serotonin, serotonin has something to do with mood. It also has something to do with motivation. It also has something to do with sexual arousal and orgasm and desire. So when you take the SSRI, and the serotonin is, the system's engulfed with more serotonin because you're prohibiting the reuptake. You're finding that debilitating depression or anxiety is flattened, it's lessened. But there are other things that happen too, such as inability to have sexual excitation. Kind of anhedonia and lethargy is described, loss of energy. And these are called side effects, but we call them side effects because they're things that are inconvenient to us, when in actuality these are not merely side effects, these are other aspects that serotonin functions in that we're playing around with when we take the medication. In opponent processing theory, as Lemke describes it, and this she describes in chapter 2 of the book. Lemke describes that there's opponent processes in emotions. Pleasure and pain are not different, separate things, but just like two colors are processed, they're complementary, they're oppositional with each other. She, in her book, let's see, you can see an example of what I'm describing here if you look at page 54. She does this seesaw. And on one side she says is pleasure, the other is pain. And the connection, the thing that is a connecting neurotransmitter with pleasure and pain is dopamine. The more you do something, every time you post something on Instagram, Facebook, whatever you're using, every time you send a text message, there's a surge that comes up, a dopamine surge, and also an adrenaline surge in some instances. But remember, adrenaline, noradrenaline, sympathetic, parasympathetic functions are also functioning as neurotransmitters. So when you have any hormone it's the same chemical substance, it's just functioning in two different systems, neurotransmitter and hormone. So when you are doing something, liking, posting a photograph of yourself or of something, these instances of getting social recognition, social acceptance, being praised, this comes down to a lived experience as well. Looking for attention seeking, we call it in psychotherapy. There's a buzz in the anticipation. How many people are going to like this? Is so-and-so going to notice? Every post is usually a post for someone. It's sent out as if it's a general nonchalant thing, but you're usually trying to, if you think about who you're sending that out for, it's very revealing. So the anticipation, not just how many likes you get, but the anticipation causes a lifting of dopamine. Dopamine, this neurotransmitter. And this is the neurotransmitter that if you restrict it in mice, you can put food in front of the mouse or the rat, and they won't look at the food. There's something about not the food, but about the underlying, remember Lacan, the underlying desire and the function of dopamine. When you're flooding the system with dopamine, the opponent processing theory, as Lemke describes it in chapter 2, when you're flooding the system with the anticipation of the likes, the anticipation of the approval and recognition you're going to get. It's called a stroke. You're going to get stroked for some photograph you posted somewhere to impress people, whatever. It's not just them liking it, but it's your anticipation that floods the system. Go without your phone. Go. I know the feeling. I'm out hiking, and I live in the mountains, and I'm out hiking, and it can be frightening. I hike alone many times, and they're bare, and there are sometimes people escape from prison, and they're running around, and they all tend to show up in Pennsylvania for some reason, in the mountains where I live. So I'm in the Poconos, and I'm in the woods, and there's a certain security or safety I feel because my mobile phone is there, along with my bear spray. I have a big canister of bear spray for protection, and also an air horn to make noise to scare bears off. Bobcats too. Bobcats usually run away, but so do bear, but I don't want to mess around with bear. So I look down at the phone, and there are no bars. I'm in isolation, and all of a sudden this fear comes over me, a feeling of aloneness. Do you relate to this? It's an existential dread. Sartre talked about this, nausea. Heidegger talked about this in Angst, Nietzsche as well. It's this disconnect, like I suddenly feel isolated and alone from other people. Remember, I'm a lived experience person. So I'm a psychologist. So I'm describing you lived experience. And I bet you too have been out driving someplace, and maybe it's getting unfamiliar to you, and it's getting darker out, and you have no reception on your phone, and a certain feeling of dread and anxiety comes in. It turns out that this experience, this feeling of having this safety here all the time, this telephone, this text, I'm not alone. Some people have a difficult time being alone. When they're alone, they don't know what to do. They seek interaction with other people because the feeling of being alone is so dreadful. This happens with social media. This happens with technology. It happens with the smartphone. It happens with Facebook and TikTok and Instagram. And the mechanism that seems to be functioning here, at least part of it that we're discussing in Dopamine Nation, is that the system, because of this constant stimulation that causes this dopamine to keep releasing, and then it reaches a threshold, and the habituation takes place, so you have to do it more, you have to look more, you have to post more to get that same level of dopamine. It's an artificial level of dopamine coming in. Then what happens is no service on the cell phone, no Wi-Fi, and you're alone. An existential dread fills you, and that existential dread is a absence of the level of the dopamine that your body has been programmed to find it normal, habituated to. So in this way, the only way that you can get back to a homeostasis is like your thermostat in your house or your apartment or your car, and you put it at 65 degrees, and when it's cold outside, once it drops before the thermometer drops below 64, the furnace kicks on and it brings it back up to 65, and the furnace turns off. On, off, and it keeps the temperature right at 65. If you're constantly supercharging that so that you always have your heat turned up to 70, the dopamine is leads to this. Once that is gone, once the furnace stops working, there's no more dopamine there. It drops down and you feel really cold. I hope this is a good analogy that I'm giving here, a good way to explain this. And what would be your normal baseline now feels frightening. That's called withdrawal. Withdrawal is the body reacting to the lack of what it has become, the loss of dopamine that it's become habituated to. Same thing with sugar, caffeine. Sugar and caffeine can have the same effect as smartphone, video game, pornography, as we saw in the last section. How long does it take? The body can reset itself. And what all the research is pointing to is that at minimum, you have to abstain for 30 days, at minimum, for the body to begin to kick into a reestablishing of its natural homeostasis. That is, let me give you an example. If you're eating chocolate every day, like happens to me now that it's getting a little colder out in the fall and the winter, I get the craving for Toblerone. Lindt chocolate's my favorite. So you eat the chocolate and it wakes up certain sugar yeast things in your body, and then once you start eating it, you crave it. If you don't eat it, you forget about it after a few days. The body adjusts to this. But once you start having sugar in your diet, it wakes something up biologically, and you begin craving it more. In this way, abstaining from the sugar, it's primarily the sugar, abstaining from that sugar has the benefit of turning off the desire. This is very fascinating. A nutritionist, this is a nutrition class taught me this, professor of nutrition. And you'll find this is true with most things that are addictive. Once you get away from it, the desire eventually goes away. However, some things take longer than others. And for this dopamine homeostasis to readjust to whatever our individual natural functioning is, not unlike caffeine or sugar, it takes time for the brain to readjust, neuroplasticity. It takes time for those neural pathways to change, for those neurotransmitters to readjust to homeostasis. And after what Lemke and other researchers are finding is that after about a month, there's a noticeable effect, and after 2 months, most of her patients, she teaches and sees patients at Stanford University, most of her patients have a clinically significant decline in addiction behavior, depression, and anxiety. And she claims that other research backs this, that along with this abstaining from the activity, also physical exercise, getting into the woods. I send out some announcements as getting into wilderness. In other words, unplugging from this digital situation we're in. That is more effective than psychotropic medications in dealing with addictions, anxiety, and depression. The difficult thing is our body habituates to this new homeostatic level once we're doing something. And when that's taken away, our body reacts in a painful way with the withdrawal symptoms. So what Alter discusses and what Lemke is describing in her book here on Dopamine Nation is the power of concentrating on that seesaw of pleasure and pain, that once you allow yourself to feel unpleasure, this comes back to the pleasure principle of Freud, once you allow yourself to experience pain, and the pain is not indulging in the thing that's bringing you pleasure, abstaining. In the Buddhist tradition, and this comes back incidentally to Schopenhauer as the first Western philosopher to really discuss the value of asceticism, denial of the will, denial of desire. He said the only way you really liberate yourself is to free yourself of desire. This is nirvana. Nirvana is the extinguishing of the flame of desire. Very much we'll see this. But society, our next topic is going to be Erich Fromm, and we'll learn from that we're often healthy individuals living in sick societies, and that what we really have to do is treat society. That's the revolution of hope that we'll be discussing and reading in our next section. But the idea here is that through all of the media that we consume, that if we step away from it, if we turn it off, if we detox from this, that the body is allowed to go back to a homeostasis that's more natural for us. This means, think of it just as mood. Schopenhauer tells us it's useless to seek happiness, as do the Eastern psychologist and cognitive psychology, as influenced through Stoicism. The idea is that the origins of cognitive psychology is Stoic, Greco-Roman Stoic philosophy. And the idea here is that if you are always doing things to get excited, to be happy, if you're trying to be happy, happy is up here. I'm happy, right? And the opposite, the other extreme of happy is depressed. Now, a lot of people in contemporary society treat that it's an either or, happy, depressed, happy, depressed. You don't hear much about this little place in the middle, the homeostasis. You know what that's called? Content. In content, nothing's good, nothing's bad. You're just content. Content. We're seeking, maybe this is political, we're seeking craving happiness constantly. Happy is what happens when your brain is fired up with the dopamine because you get a surprise visit from someone you love, or you get a gift or attention, something that's happy. And then depressed is when that is lack. So and content is just content. We have our new homeostasis is chasing after this happy, this artificial level, so that when nothing is stimulating the dopamine and we come just back down to content, we're actually experiencing this as depression and sadness, as emptiness. Do you see how it's become a warped point of view? And we can talk about it in lived experience ways, phenomenologically, as we're doing here, like you would do in a clinical setting, a counseling setting. Or you can talk about it in biological terms of dopamine. It's not necessarily the thing, it's the dopamine that's triggering the thing. So how do you counter this? Well, what Lemke describes is, and this is in part 3, so from chapter 7 through 9, it's all about the power of resisting and saying no to the piece of chocolate. I remember when I was studying with my Jungian teacher, Jungian analyst teacher at the New School for Social Research, I remember him talking about the power of remaining with discomfort. Discomfort is a great teacher. And he said he would be in the aisle at the grocery store, the market, and he'd look down and he'd see the bar of Toblerone. Now, he also studied in Switzerland, so just like me, we have a lot of emotional things wrapped up with that Toblerone, because Toblerone's the thing that you went and you bought on the way to class. And you sat in class, and everybody in the class, in our classrooms, we had coffee, so we all had our coffee and our Toblerone, and that kept us going through the 3-hour lecture. And you see, I'm smiling. I just got a dopamine hit because there's good memories with this. It's not just the sugar. It's not just the caffeine. It's the emotions wrapped up in that state, the Toblerone. And so you go through the grocery store and you get older, and these times are in the past, and you romanticize them, and we hold them dear to our identity, and we look and see the Toblerone and say, oh, Toblerone. And all these warm feelings, dopamine, all these warm feelings come in. And he described the importance of saying no and asking oneself, what is it I'm really desiring at this moment? What do I really desire at this moment? And if you meditate on this, if you think about this, what you find is what you really want at that moment is something that Toblerone is a substitute for. You're boosting that dopamine. Maybe it's a hug. Maybe it's to live once again, or maybe to realize that the fantasy of what was once great never was really that great. And what we're really craving is what that symbolically represents for our present lives, to live these exciting moments that we've created from our past, perhaps. The important thing to realize is that when you say no, we come back and we learn from the experience. We say to ourselves, what is this craving about? And you wait and you let the craving pass, and then you move on to something else. And slowly that chase of happiness, this dopamine level up here, after a month or two, blah, 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 it comes back to a normal homeostasis, as Lemke. And we no longer experience this need, this incessant need to chase the dopamine rush and other neurochemicals that comes from the anticipation of people liking or acknowledging what we put on the social media, who texted me, what did I miss out on, what's in the news. See, Lemke, her examples in her clinical setting run the gambit from heroin to porn addiction to, it's incredible. She has Jacob. She opens the chapter up with Jacob, the book up with Jacob, and all the way to the end, she's following Jacob's story. And this is a guy who became so hooked, not on the orgasm with pornography, but on the moment of this dopamine, this constant dopamine release that happens through constant stimulation, that he actually got into some, as she describes in this book, some very not only bizarre but dangerous endeavors with hooking electrodes up to his genitals and doing this in online communities where other people gave other people the opportunity to control the electrical impulses, etc. And it ruined his marriage and his life and his workplace. It became this obsession for him. She follows this story of Jacob and others in this book and how he came to terms with this. And again, just like the porn addiction example, what she says is most people can't get through that month. Most people can't get through a couple days and they're back to ask someone to leave behind their mobile phone. It's something that you have to really commit yourself to, and most people just can't do that. Don't do it. Choose not to, as Fritz Perls would say. Do you remember the Albert Bandura study? The study with the Bobo doll? The idea, the evidence that we've seen repeated over and over again, that children will repeat what they see represented to them on the screen. I want you to listen to this. In 2000, I'm reading from page 26. To me, this is the moment. This is the most jarring moment in this whole book for me. In 2018, I served as medical expert witness in the case of a man who plowed his truck into two teenagers, killing both. Dopamine Nation. He was driving under the influence of drugs. As part of that litigation, I spent time talking to Detective Vince Dudo, a lead crime investigator for Placer County, California, where the trial took place. Curious about his work, I asked him about any changes in patterns he'd seen over the last 20 years. he told me about the tragic case of a 6-year-old boy who sodomized his younger 4-year-old brother. Quote, "Normally, when we get these calls," he said, "it's because some adult the child has contact with is sexually abusing him. And then the kid reenacts it on another kid, like this little brother. But we did thorough investigation, and there was no evidence the older brother was being abused. His parents were divorced, they worked a lot, so the kids were kind of raising themselves. But there was no active sexual abuse going on." Quote, "What eventually came out in this case was the older brother had been watching cartoons on the internet and stumbled across some Japanese anime cartoons showing all kinds of sex acts. The kid had his own iPad, and no one was policing what he was doing. And after watching a bunch of these cartoons, he decided to try it out on his little brother. Now, that kind of thing, in more than 20 years of police work, I've never seen before." Lemke says, "The internet promotes compulsive overconsumption not merely in providing increased access to drugs, old and new, but also by suggesting behaviors that otherwise may never have occurred to us. Videos just don't go viral. They literally are contagious, hence the advent of the meme. Human beings are social animals. When we see others behaving in a certain way online, those behaviors seem to be normal because other people are doing them. Twitter is an apt name for the social media messaging platform favored by pundits and presidents alike. We are like flocks of birds. No sooner has one of us raised a wing in flight and the entire flock is rising into the air." That is an incredibly insightful vignette of social contagion, of how young children in particular can view something online, become curious. Now, what is curiosity? I love curiosity, but curiosity is also the dopamine hit. We get anything that gets you hooked, it's a hook. And anything that gets you hooked has a spike in this dopamine. And then to the children, in an attempt to satisfy their curiosity, might do things. And this is why it's so important, of course, for parents to really be aware of what's going on. I want to share with you the ingredients of addiction for technology, for media. So we're not only talking about content, but also the phone itself, the computer itself, whatever it is. So this comes from Lemke, the 4 addictive ingredients. For something to be addictive, you have to have access to it. So in other words, if you have no access to something, then your problem's solved because you don't have access to it. With media, the implications are we have, and this comes from Adam Alter's book, Irresistible, we no longer have stop cues. What are stop cues? Stop cues are when you're reading a book, you come to the end of a chapter and then you put it down. Stop cues are when you're watching a movie, it comes to an end. There's stop cue. When you're watching the news is an example of stop cues. Some people have a dopamine kick addiction to the news. All they want to do is post on Trump or post on Biden or post on whatever's going on in the news, and they get they're addicted to the rush that comes with their political activities. And it's exhausting. And other people thrive on it, and some people, they get into the chain, and this is one of the dangers of social media. It turns into a big feedback loop, and people, maybe one of the smartest things you can do is not respond. So there's no stop cue. It's a constant feed. internet is always on. Facebook, Twitter, whatever, Instagram, whatever you're using is always on. There was a time when I was growing up when the news came on once in the morning, once in the afternoon news, and the evening news. 3 times a day for an hour or a half hour in the afternoon. And that's what you got. You had to wait till the evening news to find out what happened. There were stop cues. There was a pause in the late 80s, early 90s with CNN. Ted Turner introduced the 24/7 news flow. That means you could turn on the television and it was this constant 24 hours as it happened. And it created a documented anxiety in the world. And culture, things shifted. There was no stop cue. There's no way of it ending on its own to help you out. We have, as Alter describes, Netflix, Prime, set in default to continue on to the next episode. No stop cue. Just keeps going. Access. It's there, and any stopping has to come from your own personal volition. A strength that says no. Many people don't have the ability to say no. Walter Mischel, Marshmallow Study. Instantaneous gratification. So number 1, access. Limit the access to the thing. Set boundaries with your technology, as Lemke says, as Alter says. Set boundaries with your technology, and you will start to develop a more healthful rebalancing of this experience, and at a neurological level with the dopamine. Quantity. The quantity of something is, if the more you use it, the more you desire it. Remember the sugar. And incidentally, I grew up not eating sugar. My parents felt that sugar was unhealthful. This might be why I'm 50 years old and I've never had a cavity. And in my later life, I started to crave chocolate, but not sugar so much as chocolate. But it's probably the sugar in the chocolate. But I don't crave sweet stuff. I don't like candy, but I love chocolate. Chocolate. I crave it. I also love chocolate donuts. Okay, so quantity. The more I know if I go to that store and I give in to the chocolate donut craving, or the chocolate Lindt, or the Toblerone, if I give in to that, I'm going to start craving it every day. Then the craving becomes bigger. If I just stop and ignore it, I don't get that craving. It's very interesting. So quantity, as Lemke discusses. The more you check your phone, the more you're on social media, the more you post, it awakens this desire. Dopamine. The potency. What is potency? Potency is how strong the effect is how strong the effect is in the pleasure-pain opponent processing. So in other words, the more you do it, the more you say yes to it, it becomes the potency is the level, the natural level that becomes habituated, and then to do something other than that creates a great feeling of discomfort. So the potency is, it has this synergistic build of what is, and you have to do the exact opposite in an equal way. In other words, abstain to rebalance that. So that's the potency of the act. The more you do something, the stronger it gets, is the potency. And finally, the fourth addictive ingredient is novelty. And as we know from evolutionary psychology, and Adam Alter actually in his book Irresistible really concentrates quite a bit on novelty. This is the idea that things are built into the video games, into the news, the 24/7 news flow, breaking news, this just in, a new, whatever you call on this horrible Yahoo News, which is all clickbait stuff. That you look at the titles. The titles on Yahoo News are distinctly different from most, and BBC's guilty of this too, but go to BBC or NPR and you won't find these sensational headlines that get you in novelty. Novelty is what's new. It's this little thing that changes in the environment that keeps distracting us. Every time the novelty hits, the dopamine pops. So these are some important things to consider. The book is incredible, and because she's a therapist, she's a psychiatrist, she offers some very specific plans if you're dealing with this, that with any type of addiction of any sort. She does not simply see addiction as a cause and effect relationship between a chemical substance. She sees an underlying third term, which is the neurotransmitter dopamine. Stay tuned, because this is just the latest in these discussions. It's interesting as you read this book, notice that all these resources, all the people are pointing towards the benefits of mindfulness meditation to counter turning off the phone and being silent for 20 minutes a day and not looking at the phone to see if someone messaged you. This is a beginning to taking control and setting boundaries with one's self, with one's desires. So Eastern philosophy comes into this. Suddenly, Schopenhauer's pessimism of denying oneself has great value. And Lemke really outlines the powerful therapeutic effects of saying no to desires and impulses. It's something that's not very popular today in our culture, but I have a feeling that these attitudes will be changing over the next decade as we realize more and more that maybe always feeling good might not be such a good idea. Okay, that's what I have to offer to you about Dopamine Nation. Please not only read the text, but read through the TED Talk, listen to the TED Talk's Adam Alter interview. This is a great Harvard University article on dopamine smartphones. What happens when, it's going to click, what happens when dopamine smartphones and you a battle for your time. And this goes into detail about things that I've introduced to you here, about dopamine release through behaviors. Let's see. We also have more TED Talks. Some of this stuff gets flagged when it plays in copyright when I videotape things, so I have to avoid doing that. But there's some other articles here. Oh, the Terry Gross article. Terry Gross, if you don't know her, she's a NPR host from Philadelphia. She does a talk show called Fresh Air, and she interviewed here Adam Alter on All Tech Considered. That's a great interview to read, or listen to rather. And also here, 5 questions for Adam Alter on the APA website, the APA Monitor. Social psychologist explains the psychological and physical factors that make technology so addictive and how to break the cycle. I hope you find this to be useful and interesting, and I'm looking forward to reading your papers. Enjoy your studies. Get out into go to a wilderness area. Put your phone in, keep your phone in the car, turn it off, and see what happens.